and the struggle for freedom in Africa. This is a program that brings to the spotlight the leaders that are at the forefront of these ongoing fights and seeks to build solidarity among them. So in that spirit, we've convened voices today that are prominent African professionals and campaigners who will help us to unpack the often shady world of PR and lobby firms, as well as the reputation management marketing companies that help authoritarian leaders to launder their images in the media and foreign capitals. Our speakers today include Dina Din from Kenya, one of the world's foremost public relations experts, Kathleen Dongmo, a Cameroon communications and marketing expert. We also have Tebe Igalafeng, an award-winning marketer who has built numerous brand management companies. We also have Corinne Nandulia, the African Advocacy Director at Human Rights Watch. We're also joined as a discussant by Alex Dukalski, a professor based in Ireland who studies authoritarian states and how they manage their global images. We're also very lucky to have Alex with us today, who has recently wrote a book on this topic, Making the World Safe for Dictatorship. And as always, we also have our colleague, Nick Chisman, who managed today's Q&A at the end of the program to close out our session. Welcome to the Resistance Bureau. And Alex, it's great to see you. So for those that are more interested in learning the more biographical details of today's participants, please check out our website, www.theresistancebureau.com. You can also catch up on past episodes and read more about our vision, our guiding principles, as well as our plans going forward. For today's program, you can also keep track of the discussion on Twitter, follow us at Resist Bureau and use the hashtag Resist Bureau Live. Right now, we're live streaming on Facebook and on YouTube, but we're also recording the show for later distribution. So I'm just going to hand it over to Jeff to give us a brief introduction of today's topic. Jeff, over to you.
Thank you so much, Mentade. You are completely right. This is an important subject. And on today's program, we're going to turn our attention to one of what I think, and what most of us on this program today think, is one of the most overlooked scandals in global politics today. Namely how PR firms and high-priced lobbyists in democratic countries often work to make dictators and authoritarian ones look good by helping to whitewash their images, often following stolen elections and brutal crackdowns on human rights. Almost all authoritarian leaders are concerned, of course, about how they are perceived around the world, especially in the media and in foreign capitals. From Ethiopia to Zimbabwe, from Cameroon to Rwanda, and from Equatorial Guinea to Uganda, even the most brutal despots want to look good in the eyes of the world. As a result, they often devote millions of dollars, money that could perhaps be better spent on providing food and healthcare for their own citizens, on public relations firms that buy positive media coverage, and also on foreign lobbyists who push an airbrushed image to investors, lending institutions, and even think tanks and universities across the world. At every step of the way, authoritarianism is aided and abetted by Western companies and their employees, who seem willing to work with any regime, regardless of how oppressive it might be, so long as it pays. African dictators and others around the world do not engage in such efforts merely out of vanity, though that is certainly a key element. Indeed, image management and lobbying are critical to their ability to retain power and influence. A high-priced public relations campaign can help to obscure or otherwise sideline valid human rights concerns, while encouraging foreign investment and promoting tourism, while boosting the personal coffers of these same corrupt leaders. Effective lobbying can remove targeted sanctions, increase aid, and even lessen the impact of criticism from other world leaders and pro-democracy activists at home and abroad. Today, our brilliant assembled speakers will help us to unpack how Western companies are helping to whitewash these flawed images of Africa's authoritarian leaders, and we'll ask how these practices can be effectively called out and ultimately resisted. Of course, we will also, as always, want to hear from what all of you think in the audience. Have your say by sending a note to our WhatsApp number, +263 77 623 8199. If you didn't catch that, the number is also available on both our Twitter and Facebook feeds. Thanks, as always, for your constructive engagement. We have a really busy agenda today, so Mentade, let's get started. Back over to you.
Thank you so much, Jeff. So I'm just going to get straight to you, Gina. I think because for decades now, you've been successfully working in the field of public relations, including on behalf of African governments and companies. Do PR professionals such as yourself and your colleagues follow any industry standards that might be in place? And what, if any, accountability mechanisms are there? For example, if a company is clearly profiting off a dictator's checkbook at the expense of its people?
Hi, thank you, and thank you for having me. I think lobbying and PR around the world is generally self-regulated. I know, at least on the continent of Africa, there are not many laws around this. Interestingly enough, in the US, the lobbying laws have been there since 1938. So clearly lobbying has been alive and well for a very long time in the US. In my particular business, what sort of work we took on was very much based on what our own values as a business were. And, personally, I think, there's lots of ways of looking at lobbying, and I think lobbying itself has a reputational issue because we're always looking at lobbying in a very negative sense. When there are times that it is very important for countries to lobby. So it'll be interesting to have a discussion today based on that. But as a general rule, there's very little regulation in Africa around the area of PR and lobbying.
Thanks, Gina. Just to follow up on that quickly, I'd like to ask you about the difference or the tensions, perhaps, that may exist that often play out here domestically and internationally. In other words, I'd like to ask you, why do governments in Kenya, for example, which you are quite familiar with, why do they bring in outside firms? Like we're all familiar, for instance, with Cambridge Analytica or BTP Advisors based in London and other firms. Why do they bring in these outside experts when there's clearly so much talent at home and around the African continent?
Well, I think the lobbying work that needs to be done usually needs to be done to Western countries, and so the connections are with the Western PR and lobbying firms who have the contacts in Congress or in other Western countries. So coming to companies that are based on the continent would actually not help because we don't have the contacts that the Western companies do. Also, I think for Kenyan or African PR companies, its PR and lobbying is in its infancy. So this is a pretty new phenomenon for us. And like I said, it's been going on for years in the Western world. So the chances are that it's the Western companies that would be more, first of all, willing to take on that kind of work. And also, I think there's an element of, as Africans, we want the correct stories out there. We want to shape the African conversation, but not at the cost of it, being at the risk of health, as you mentioned earlier, or security or education. The money could be spent going to the African people. So I think there's a reluctance in local companies to do that, and yet Western companies are quite willing to do that.
Right. Thank you so much. Actually, sort of following up on that, Tebe, I think you're perfect to bring in here because, like Gina, you too are a seasoned professional in this field. And although, as Gina mentioned, Africa, PR in Africa is in its infancy stages. However, you've been doing this for quite some time. You've worked with hundreds of clients across the continent. So I'm wondering, do you see a trend in the countries that invest in these PR and lobby firms? And following up on that, how do these governments continue to afford these expensive services? And they can be quite expensive, given the poor economic management and the innate corruption we sometimes see in authoritarian regimes that invest heavily in these campaigns. I'd be interested in your thoughts on that. Tebe, I think you might be on mute.
Let me follow up let me start at the second point in terms of how do governments or how do people follow up? How do people avoid all this? I think I want to build on Gina's argument. I think essentially in this fundamental level, there is nothing wrong with trying to shape a perception because everybody wants to create a good perception of themselves. Now, if you look at the African story, which is where the big challenge is, unfortunately, the story of the continent is never told by Africans themselves. If you look at 63%, recent survey by Africa No Filter established that 63% of the media companies that are reporting on Africa do not have a correspondent in Africa. And 1% of all the stories that they make, only 1% of the content comes from African journalists or African correspondents themselves. So fundamentally, there's a big problem. There's a problem that Africans themselves needs to take a hold, needs to start telling their own story. We need to find a way to start telling our own story. And our story is beautiful, our story is broad, and our story is different, and our story is difficult. There are highlights of our stories and there are lowlights about who we are. Why do we go out? Why do we go out out of the continent? Traditionally, because, as Gina said, it's such an infant stage where the idea of telling your story is, because Africans in general, we're very gullible in many ways, or rather we're very trusting. I think that's the right word. We're very trusting. I think Jomo Kenyatta once said, when the missionaries came to Africa, they taught us how to pray with our eyes closed. When we opened our eyes, we had the Bible in their hands and they had the land in theirs. So we're a very gullible people. And unfortunately, that has not changed even up to now. We're still in that state. How do we defend it? I think the way we are going to have to defend this is on two levels. One, from being aware that, quote unquote, we are being used. We are being used against ourselves. So we need to be aware of that. Second, we need to be educating ourselves in terms of how do we tell our story. So when you listen to people talking about why Africans are not telling that story, they say, oh, well, they don't have the skills, they don't have the know-how of how to do this. So unfortunately, that has then continued to go on to the rest of the world that says Africans do not know how to tell their story, and our own leaders then begin to say, let me trust somebody else outside. Of course, some of the other reasons they trust people outside is because they can't trust us inside, because we will tell the story exactly as it is, because it is our countries, it's our continent, and it's our story.
So Tebe, there's something that you mentioned that I find very interesting. You say that there's nothing wrong with shaping a perception, and that's something I totally agree with you on. And I think going back to something that Jeffrey mentioned earlier, that when this narrative or this shaping of a perception comes at the cost of livelihoods and the reality of people within the continent or within the different countries, I think the bigger question that's coming in to say, where do we draw the line? I'll give you an example of Zimbabwe. One of the biggest challenges that we've been having is that there's been some form of discrepancy between the narrative that is given by the government and all these other, institutions, companies that are hired, called to, stand in and kind of shape the perception on behalf of the government. But when you come into Zimbabwe and ask Mandate or anyone within this country what is happening on the ground, you discover that there are two realities, there are two narratives that are there. So I think coming back to you as a question would be to say, what then is your advice? Because you're saying it's important for us to own this narrative. What is your advice to these young and upcoming African PR and marketing professionals who want to make a positive impact in the profession about how to manage, the inherent risks?
Unfortunately for the old types of PR, for the old types of lobbyists, unfortunately for them, the world has transformed so much, and technology has empowered the young PR, the young person, so much that irrespective of what they're trying to spin, if it is founded on untruths, the truth will always come out anyway. Because remember, the media is no longer like in the past being owned by conglomerates or groups of people. The media now is owned by you and I. Having a cell phone, having a computer, having a pen, you're a journalist yourself. So you're a journalist that you can tell your story yourself. So I think what needs to happen is, as Africans, we just need to begin to insist on telling the story and constantly correcting it. And you are beginning to see a whole lot of that now. You're beginning to see young Africans telling the story in their own way. And the story, like I say, is quite diverse, whether it's a story about creativity, whether it's a story about governance, whether it's a story about commerce. You are seeing that across board now, with the young Africans, young PR agencies beginning to tell that story. I'm not sure whether the story of trying to create a false narrative or a parallel narrative is going to last longer anymore, because that's an old world that we could never ever live in, that will never ever be able to come true again. So I think we have to own the story. We have to tell the story. We have to invest in enabling young agencies, young storytellers to be able to articulate themselves. But most importantly, as an African, we need to trust each other, Because though if you don't trust another African, then you'll never be able to get your story out there. To me, that's fundamentally that's where the issue is. Other parallels narratives which are untrue, of course there are. There's tons of them. There's tons of stories which are not true, which are being peddled by other people, some among us as in whether it's leaders or whether it's business people, or we're trying to create a different narrative to what it is. But that's never going to last any longer. Because as you saw, for example, in the story of Bell Pottinger in South Africa, with a false narrative about on behalf of one of the leaders in South Africa, it pretty much got out before they thought they had won the story. And how did it get out? Because you also have to have very strong journalists, and investigative journalists, and you have a lot of those in the continent. When you come to countries like South Africa, like Kenya, like Nigeria, journalists are fearless there. They pretty much drive. They pretty much are focused on telling the story. So yes, you can create a false narrative in Washington, but you're not going to get it right in Lagos, Nairobi, and Johannesburg, because that's where the reality is.
Thank you so much, Tebe. Kathleen, I want to bring you into this conversation. I already mentioned with the example of Zimbabwe, of course, that there's certain narratives that are given by governments or dictatorships, as it were. And I want to bring you in because you're someone from Cameroon, and you know all too well how the PR and lobby firms are used to provide a facelift for dictatorship. So in the past few years alone, the Paul Biya regime has spent literally millions on lobbying, employing at one point Cloud Public Affairs, Clover Park Group, and Mercury Public Affairs, several of the biggest lobby firms in the world. What does the spending spree actually tell us about the state of affairs in Cameroon?
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. So, like you say, as of July 2017, the Biya regime has spent upwards of $3.2 million on whitewashing their image and their reputation. And of course, different firms have been used. Those millions have come from the Cameroonian taxpayer. What does that say? It simply says that they would put their credibility with Western partners, and they would put their recognition with on the international scene first before they would put the average Cameroonian. And it's incredibly sad, because the amount of money that the government spends on PR and lobbying Western firms is the amount of money they can spend simply doing what they're supposed to do, and doing good governance. It's really that simple. So I think that we've gotten to a point, and even more recently, it's getting to a point where the old guard is transitioning into the new guard. So there is currently in Cameroon a Friends of Frank Biya campaign going on, because there are reports that the president's son will probably take over from the president. So we need to get to a point where we not only understand what is going on, but we see beyond the government mechanisms. And as a people, we begin to look at the different strategies that we can use to counter that and to push back against that. And I know that we're going to get to that point, but the reality is that a lot of Cameroonians, a lot of Africans, a lot of Central Africans, and this is a very dicey sub-region in Africa because of past, previous colonial intricacies, different languages. Cameroon speaks English and French. So the lobbying can be from French companies, it can be from US companies, it can be UK companies. The intricacies are so many and varied that if we don't begin to, as CSO stakeholders, push back, we're going to have a transition, unfortunately, of that, where the old guard is going to hand over the baton to the new guard, and you never know where it's going to take the country and its people to.
Thanks so much, Kathleen, for that. I'm so happy to have you here today, and I'm such an admirer of your work, because you have your feet in seemingly two different worlds, right? You're a trained communications professional, but you're also an outspoken activist who, as we've just heard, has called out by name many of the firms that have been on the payroll of the Paul Biya dictatorship. In some cases, as our viewers might know, these deals were actually terminated after being called out by activists such as yourself on social media, in the media, and elsewhere. So my question for you is, being at the forefront of these efforts for so long and being so brave and using your voice for this cause, do you think naming and shaming is the most effective strategy here? Or are there more effective ways to essentially get the job done? It would be really great to hear your thoughts on that.
That's a great question, Jeff. I think that it's a combination of strategies that should be highly targeted towards the firms as well as towards the governments. And people might ask why, a communication specialist is going to be at the forefront of speaking up and calling out. It's really, really simple. One, I believe personally and very strongly in using your skill, what you're good at, what you can do to actually make change happen. So I don't believe in being a square peg in a round hole when it comes to people power, citizen action, and advocacy. I am a communications professional. I was trained as a journalist. Any smart credible journalist will tell you our job is literally to make change happen with our pens, with our voices, and to empower people. That's our job. So I'm glad to do this as a person and as a professional. Now, in terms of the different strategies, I think one, people power is very important. So I've been calling out these different firms. In 2017, I publicly called out Squire Patton blogs, and one of the things that happened was Cameroonians rallied. We went on their Google referral page, and within a day, we had 1,000 bad reviews. Crazy stuff. They started scrambling, trying to see how they're going to take that off. Some of those reviews are still there up till today. People need to know that this firm is not just there to do good PR work. This firm is using its pen as a gun against innocent Africans. So we did that. Now, that people power is so interesting. In 2017, I also think that the protest that was held by Rwandans against Squire Patton in DC also had impact. And also what was just recently mentioned about the end of Bell Pottinger in South Africa. This people power is so important because when a people collectively stand up against an issue, that issue likely goes mainstream, and also the eyes of the world begin to see what is going on, and people take note. Whether it becomes successful or not is another thing. And I think there are different levels to this. The second one, I think another strategy is the role of the African diaspora can never be undermined. This is a diaspora that contributes millions and millions and millions of dollars in remitter funds alone. So they not only empower Africans in Africa, they have the power in these different countries to quote unquote lobby different officials and agencies to do the right thing and to see what is going on. One of these organizations is an organization called Coalition for Dialogue and Negotiation, a Cameroonian organization in the US that has been doing all it can to bring to light what is happening in the English-speaking regions of Cameroon since a civil war broke out in 2017. Another way, I think sanctions are so important, Jeff. So the caveat with sanctions is that sanctions should affect the despotic leaders more than they should affect the people. So for example, the US is currently freezing funding for Ethiopia with regards to the atrocities that are being committed in Tigray. I think that is so important for us to push for these sort of very unique, deliberate sanctions to happen so that these governments should, be penalized one way or another. It's so important. Cameroon was pulled out of AGOA. probably not because we shouted about a PR and lobbying whitewash, but I think that if that can happen, we can use really systemic strategies to achieve these kinds of sanctions. Another one is broad-based local civil society influence. So we have, organizations like Vanguard. You all need to be speaking with the Department of Justice in the US. You all need to be calling them out and saying, listen, we have laws here that say this is how these PR companies should operate. This is what they should show us in terms of transparency and their books. I think it is so important. And the last one that I think is litigation. Whether you like it or not, there's hardly any opposition to the activities that these companies carry out in Africa. That's clear. But in one case, a Cameroonian American lawyer called Jiggy Ta filed a lawsuit in the US against the Cameroonian government. He lost the lawsuit due to inadequate evidence. That's just it. And he said that, these companies, the PR companies, indirectly encourage human rights violations. Now, according to them, he probably couldn't provide the evidence of the human rights violation as a direct result of the PR and the whitewashing. But the purpose of the lawsuit is to show that these acts are unconstitutional, these contracts are unconstitutional, and once we're able to win one of those lawsuits and say, give me back my money, it's taxpayers' money, I think that there's going to be more ears, and more eyes to this issue, because it's so fundamental to the lives and the livelihoods of those that it affects.
And I think the other thing, though, is, you mentioned Tigray and Ethiopia, I think it's also important to have a balanced view. So, for example, a lot of the reporting around Ethiopia comes from one side. So you don't get a feeling that some of the decisions that have been taken, whether it's in or being influenced in DC, whether those the people who are making those decisions, do they even have an on-the-ground experience? Have they engaged with the people in the countries? So a lot of the times they make decisions about countries without being in the country. So one thing I've learned many times, and I was speaking in Switzerland many years ago, and the head of the Communist Party was on the panel, and a young man stood up from Switzerland, and he said to this woman, "You are from China. You are the things that you are doing with the people in Tibet and all those evil and all those." And this woman allowed him to speak. And when he finished speaking, he asked him a simple question. He said to this young man, "Have you been to Tibet?" And the young man says, "No." So he says, "Please, let me give you advice, young man. Never ever speak about anybody's country until you've been to the country." So unfortunately as well, you talk about these lobbyists and PR companies and wherever they all are. They don't always have a balanced view about the country, but certainly, and unfortunately, sometimes there's a negative effect, whether you come into a country like Ethiopia or all those where perhaps some of the decisions which have been taken by the White House, for example, are perhaps are not based on a balanced view of what's really happening in the country itself. I think it's important as well for one to have a balanced view. And the unfortunate thing about the African situation is that Africa is a continent of extremes. So you have people who have very different extreme views about the continent on the right side and on the long side. And then the other thing about the continent is that everybody always feels that they are being benevolent to the continent, that they are doing the right thing or helping the continent. I don't think Africa always needs people to help it. Africa needs to help itself. So our job as Africans, as young Africans, whether we're journalists or whether we are just PR people, is really to hold our own governments accountable ourselves, but most importantly is to hold our own futures in mind and ask ourselves, what kind of a future do we want as Africans? Because we can sit here all night and complain about these lobbyists, but until we get a hold of the African agenda ourselves, it's never gonna go anywhere else. And to me, that's also one of the fundamental issues. And when you brought up the Ethiopian issue, and I have very good friends obviously in every country. I haven't been to every country in the continent. I've got very good friends in all of them. So I always listen to the people on the ground and try and understand the country, and I try and go into the countries and understand the countries. And I always find such divergent reporting driven mostly because of like you say, lobbyists who are driving a different agenda, or sometimes the diaspora who have driving an agenda themselves. Because sometimes the biggest enemies of the continent are the people from the continent itself. So the continent is often found wanting, and the lobbyists have a easy targets to work with.
Gina, I think you're on mute.
Okay. The other thing that I was going to say is the people are actually paying the lists. Quite often, it's not the actors themselves. It's the private sector who have vested interests in propping up a particular regime. So I think that's really important that we look at, whether it's arms dealers or people with resource companies, oil companies. So I think it's important that we don't only look at it as a PR and lobbyist problem. It's a bigger issue than that. It's a much wider issue.
That's such an important point to make, that and I agree with you entirely on that. And that's why I always bring it back to the average African. It says, what do you want for your country? What do you want for your continent? Because until you then possess yourself with that, and you do what it takes to change the narrative or to change the course of history, nothing is going to happen. No amount of lobbyists is going to fix this continent. Yes, it may prop up or keep one or two people in power or somewhere else, or one agenda in the media, but it's not going to change the continent.
I mean, I totally understand, and I agree with the balancing of the narrative, the importance of understanding the local dynamics of the environment, and also, the importance of just knowing the hyper-local sensitivities within every country. Obviously, I cannot, quote unquote, go to every country. But here's what I think, and it is good and fine to say Africans need to lead the charge. But I always think that there is a method to the madness. And just like there's a method to the madness, we are sitting with governments, many of which have a method to the madness that they are inflicting on the people. And so I think it is important to separate the issues here and say, here we are sitting around talking about, foreign firms, being paid with our tax money. What are we going to do about it? And how are we going to work to make sure that we push back about it? There is no excluding the fact that the firms themselves and the countries that they sit in need to not only be called out, but they need somehow need to be addressed. And that's what I'm trying to address here. I am not saying by any chance that Africans should not take their destinies in hand. I am not saying that we should not stand out and push back. What I am saying is it is important for us to look and clap back at those who are affecting us even from outside. Look at Mali. People are going on the street saying that, hey, we no longer want French intervention. There is a very, very, very strong issue with 14 and more French African countries when it comes to governance. Our governance is not, quote unquote, the same as governance from English-speaking African countries. And so we try to approach this in very dynamic ways that we feel will get us at least low-hanging fruit responses.
Yeah, thanks everyone. And Kathleen, I think you brought up a really good point in your initial remarks about using the tools and the skills you have at your disposal. For instance, using this angle of PR and lobby firms working on behalf of abusive regimes like the Be a Dictatorship, for instance, as a vehicle through which to tell the broader story, right? The broader story about misrule and corruption and lack of good governance in Cameroon. So I think, Karine, this is a really good opportunity to bring you into the discussion because, as the Africa Advocacy Director for Human Rights Watch, you do this in your work, as I do, using these smaller issues to tell the broader story, right? And I know that, being based where you are, you've no doubt encountered lobbyists and spin doctors in various venues, as I certainly have in various meetings around town. So I would like to know, what is your message, hearing the talk today and from your own point of view, what is your message for the lobbyists, for instance, at Mercury Public Affairs? We've talked about them a bit as just one example. They're currently working on behalf of abusive, oftentimes long-ruling leaders in Uganda and Zimbabwe that we heard Mintade talking about. They spin what's happening in these countries in a positive light amidst the ongoing human tragedies in both of those countries. So I'm wondering, being situated where you are, the advocacy work that you do, what's your message for these companies?
That's a tricky one. Thanks, Jeff. And very happy to be with all of you today. While I was listening to my co-panelist, I remembered, I got to remember an old discussion I had with a former colleague who was talking about, we were trying to get our minds around this whole discussion and discourse around lobbying. And I think Tebes made a very good point. There's nothing wrong, I think, in terms of, how do you, wanting to portray yourself under a positive light, whether you're an individual, a state, or a company. However, when you look at the intent, and I think that's where things get a little bit changing. The intention of some of these governments, you mentioned Uganda, Zimbabwe, you have Gainful Solutions, who's contracted by South Sudan in order to help the government not to establish a war crimes court, the hybrid court, which is supposed to be established in partnership with the African Union. Then you realize that, as I mentioned, my colleague put it as a form of legalized corruption, right? A legalized corruption, which essentially then, especially when it comes to the relationship between poor or countries from the global south and countries in the global north, which happen to be more often than not their former colonial powers. So I think that's important to point out. Message to the lobbyists and the PR firms. I think beyond institutionalizing, because I think that's what it is, institutionalizing injustice and corruption. It's important to say, and I've said it in many instances, that the dealings of PR firms have, and this is an issue that is not always addressed. Their actions have far-reaching transnational consequences. I think that's you might be operating on behalf or for the interest of a specific country or an entity, but the consequences of that operation can be far-reaching, whether it's to give a bandwidth to countries, which some of them are not even African, countries like China or others, who are in pursuit of a right-free development narrative, talking about narrative. You find yourself as a PR firm, knowingly or not knowingly, providing bandwidth and fueling, really facilitating the emergence of a certain narrative that is anti-democratic, anti-freedom of speech, anti-human dignity. And I think it's very important to mention that. And in doing so, they find themselves undermining the very democratic foundations that define the environment in which they came to exist. And secondly, and I think it's important to flag, for instance, the role played by a company like Pottinger, the Pottinger case, who played a role in stoking racial tensions and conflict in South Africa. What happens is that there will be blurred lines between political maneuvering and genuine democratic grassroots movements, because what you find is a situation where tools have been given to administrations that are not necessarily operating in the best interest of the population, of the citizens they're supposed to be serving, and which practically will undo or reverse democratic change, and also from an ideological perspective. And finally, I think there is a counter narrative that is provided through the work of communication by these firms. And the narratives range from development first, human rights after, or stability versus democracy, especially for governments who have been that have learned the art of presenting, aligning the national interest to the security interest of the West, which then leads to complex pathologies in countries and domestic politics, the fragmentation of political parties. You have now NGOs that are aligned to political power, parties in power, and those who are aligned with the opposition, yeah, et cetera, et cetera.
So I want to bring in an observation. Like, and across this entire conversation, there's been so much of a focus on how this repressive regimes kind of outsource the services of lobby firms, PR firms from the West. But then on the other hand, you also have Western governments that are actually committing to the respect of human rights and a more realistic narrative of the reality of people on the ground. So it's almost a contrast, governments in African countries hiring Western firms to facelift their image. And then on the other hand, Western governments actually committing to this whole human rights, to the respect of human rights. So my question comes in to say that, like, how do we begin to have, especially activists, actually push back on those PR lobby firms, but then on the other hand, also kind of push back on governments, because some of these governments are actually coming in to say anyone that pushes a narrative that is alternative to what the government is pushing is unpatriotic and actually pushing a Western agenda. So how do you balance that, and how do you have activists actually effectively pushing back on both ends?
Can I just quickly say that the actions of some of these lobbying firms have basically led autocrats, whether on the continent or elsewhere, to quietly and consistently present a narrative that portrays the West as hypocritical and unreliable as well. I think that's important to flag. How do we, I think we have to keep in mind that all that has altered there's an international ideological consensus around democracy, good governance, and human rights that has been, that is actually crumbling. And I think that should be at the center of what we build as a strategy. In terms of pushbacks, I think Kathleen made a fantastic list of actions that can be done. But I think 2 or 3 that I would like to add is to build, activists need to rebuild a narrative, a pro-democracy narrative that is, and I'm speaking as an African as well, that is Afrocentric, and that is ours. And I think Tebe mentioned that, and it's possible. We need to build a counter-narrative that articulates the opposite of what autocrats are saying, and we're not doing that enough, I think. We need solidarity. We need to have activists in Cameroon protesting when activists in Burundi are on the streets. We need a continental Pan-African solidarity on that. We need to build a database of autocrats and allies. We need to have both, the name and shame, branding scorecards, etc. We need a rationale and a scientific political rationale to advocate for the implementation of a worldwide regulatory environment for these practices. It's not okay that the US has that, and then other parts of the world, including the African continent, is not moving in that direction. We should be moving in that direction. And then I think all the other panelists have said that, grassroots activists, again, that are politically minded and who can take advantage of the multiple opportunities that we're being faced with, for instance, digital activism. I think I'm going to stop here.
I think I wanted to add something. I think, Matatu, you spoke a little bit about governments. We should not forget the role of the Western governments as well. So if you look at that, Gina alluded to earlier how the Foreign Agents Registration was established in 1938 in the US. So in many ways, all these, and remember there's 2 classes of lobbyists. You've got the negative ones, you've got the positive ones. So all of them somehow declare when they leave their countries, where they are headed and what they're going to do. So in many ways, I think instead of going on and on about how Africans are doing this and this negative, the Western governments must also take responsibility, because they are also aiding and abetting this. So that's the one part. The second part is, of course, one also has to acknowledge the good Africans who are doing the good things in a different way, because you can't all be activists. We can't all be out in the streets throwing stones and putting up posters. But if you look at Mo Ibrahim's approach, for example, when he started with the Mo Ibrahim governance scorecard. So that scorecard it's also an interesting way it's a more institutionalized type of activism, if you will. So what we need to do as Africans is, instead of somebody having to come here and NGOs, creating NGOs, we need to institutionalize our own approaches in terms of how we are going to solve some of these problems. Because the truth of the matter is, at the end, I'll always come back to this point. There has to be a balance. So people, for example, I read somewhere they were complaining about Rwanda and Rwanda hiring PR firms. So I said to myself, so why not? Because the entire narrative about Rwanda out in the world was about the genocide. I think it was a responsible thing, and it is a responsible thing for Rwandans, for PK and anybody else, to say, how do I rewrite the story? And if you want to rewrite the story of Rwanda internationally, and you want so if you take an African to go speak to an international audience, they're not going to listen to, perhaps they're not going to listen to them. So in many ways, yes, you do have to go find those lobbyists. You do have to find those PR firms outside of the continent to come and tell the story to their own people, because they're writing for their own audience anyway. So if they're going to write for their own audience in many ways, so you perhaps have to look at them. But then, and then there's many others. You know, I know, Jeff, you're probably familiar with the people like Riva Levinson, who've worked with Salif Johnson. Again, I mean, I look at some of the work that they did around the Ebola and all those. I said, yes, because otherwise they were not going to listen to them. The rest of the West was just going to leave the continent or the countries to rot from Ebola and many issues like that. The same way that they looked away during the genocide in 1994 in Rwanda. So in many ways, these lobbyists, whatever we call them, or PR, international PR firms, they can be there for good, and many of them have done some good work in terms of what they've done. I mean, I've mentioned one for example now, and there's many others who work for others. But what we need to do, and that's why I'm in the balance space, what we need to do is we need to ensure that we have mechanisms in the continent to deal with the rogue ones. Because who dealt with Bell Pottinger? The British advertising and communications association. We should have dealt with them ourselves. So us as Africans, we should have said, how do we send them out packing out of this continent? Because in many ways, and Bell has been everywhere in the continent, from Malawi to Kenya to South Africa to Zambia, they've been everywhere like a bad plague. So what we needed to have done in the continent is we needed to have sent them backpacking the same way that they came in. Because unfortunately, we cannot be an isolationist continent, because the whole world works in symbiotic. And we're going to have to work together to progress the continent, as well as to progress the rest of the world.
I wonder, sorry.
Yeah.
No, this is just really quick. Guys, this is really quick, sorry. I wonder what the role of policy making in this whole discussion is. And that really makes me think, because when Tebe talks about how, we should bottle them and chase them out of our countries, and I mean, it's a good way to go. But you see, if you have a government who is going to sign up and have the Gupta brothers be yummy, chummy with them and make sure that policy favors them, it's hard for you to kick any of those kind of businesses out of the continent. So I think also that there is a place for policymakers. And that's why most of the times when I advocate with CSOs, I tell most of the CSOs that one of the best strategies we can actually put down as advocates and as activists is to touch on local governments and senatorial districts and talk to your senators and your MPs, because those are the people sitting in parliament and enacting policy. And we need to make sure that policy is favorable to the people. So I think there's a role of policy in this whole debate as well.
Very quick addition, and the media as well. I was just going to say.
And the media.
Thank you. Okay. There's so much one can say.
Yeah, this has been such a brilliant and engaging discussion. Thanks everyone for your comments and for your expert insights. What we're going to do now is pivot slightly. We're going to turn this discussion over to my colleague, Nick Cheeseman, and today's discussant, Alex Tucholsky, to get their thoughts on these issues, some broader context, but also to Nick and to check in on our WhatsApp channel to see what sort of questions we've received. I know we've received quite a bit. I've seen them coming in. So Nick, please, over to you.
Thanks so much, Jeff, and thanks to everyone for the great insights so far. For the panelists, I've put the questions you're going to have in the chat function. So if you want to get a sneak preview and start thinking about your responses, they're already there in the chat. And now we're going to go over to Alex, and I'm going to shut up for a bit because in Alex we have the perfect guest, because he's written a fabulous book with a great title called Making the World Safe for Dictatorship, which I would encourage you all to go and Google, not now because you need to listen to him, but in a minute after we finished. So Alex, your work looks at this in comparative perspective, not just in Africa, but globally. I think it'd be really interesting for our viewers to hear you, reflect a little bit on how this looks comparatively, what the stories you've just heard from Africa sound like compared to those from the rest of the world, and your own kind of perspectives on, what might be done about this moving forwards. Thanks so much.
Yeah, so thanks very much for having me. So as Nick mentioned, I have a book that's out last month in the United States, and I think it's coming out this week globally, called Making the World Safe for Dictatorship, published by Oxford University Press. Basically, the book is about how authoritarian states try to manage their image abroad using two sides of the same coin, right? What I call promotional image management, which is, it's very much the PR firm side of the conversation that we've been having, and obstructive image management, which is targeting either messages or messengers that are critical of the government abroad, including physically threatening or repressing dissidents who happen to be abroad. Okay? It's kind of a book about soft power built on hard foundations, and is very much global in scope. It addresses a few African states, most notably Rwanda, but it's very much global in scope. I think a key question is, why do authoritarian states care at all about how they're perceived abroad? I mean, this is something we've kind of alluded to in the conversation, but I think it's worth making explicit that they care for two very important kind of baskets of reasons. One is to improve their internal hold on power. In order to do that, it's useful to discredit foreign ideas or messengers that might be critical of the government. It might also be very directly instrumental in helping to secure aid or foreign investment that's favorable to the government's power or whatever it may be. But there's also an external security, the kind of basket of reasons to make the international information environment more conducive to that government's messages. And so that's PR firms, but it's also things like denying access to journalists domestically, like to foreign journalists who might report critically on the country. The example of Tibet was brought up earlier. Have you been to Tibet? No, but that's because foreign journalists can't go report independently there, right? So, there's a dual strategy at work here. It's not just disseminating positive messages. It's also restricting negative, access to negative information and discrediting critics. I use in the book a lot of different kinds of data, field work, interviews. I build a database of transnational repression of all cases in which authoritarian states target dissidents abroad. But I think for this conversation, probably the most relevant piece is I did a systematic kind of dive into the Foreign Agents Registration Act, which has been referred to a few times here, and which I think everybody on the call is well familiar with. Basically, a transparency law in the United States that means if you're lobbying on behalf of a foreign entity, you have to register, right? And there's a database that you can go search. Basically, what I did is I gathered all of the data from 2018 and 2019 of foreign lobbying and of public relations and lobbying work on behalf of foreign authoritarian entities. So it doesn't include things like independent companies from authoritarian states. It doesn't include opposition members from authoritarian states or activists, coming back to the conversation earlier about PR kind of having the potential to do good. It includes kind of more directly PR and lobbying on behalf of authoritarian states or embassies or political actors. Basically, you know, I talk a lot about it in the book, but I mean, the take-home message, in those 2 years, I was able to find 113 filings with a total value of between 153 and 172 million US dollars, and that's just retainer fees. So it's much more difficult to gather information on receipts and expenses and travel and all that kind of stuff that's really important. So, you know, this number, you know, 153 to 172 million is like a vast underestimate, but it kind of gives you an idea of the scale. The most active states, particularly on a per capita basis, are the Gulf states by far: Saudi Arabia, Qatar, UAE, and so on. But China and Russia are also, you know, really, really important players in this field. I was going through looking at the appendix and looking at some of the examples that were mentioned in this conversation, and like was very thankful to know that my method did capture them actually. So so they're all there, and I think that, you know, one of the things we've you know, one of the themes that's kind of run through the conversation is like, this is not an African thing. This is a global authoritarian thing in which there's plenty of blame to go around, right? So I think I'll leave it there and maybe allow the panelists to answer the question, because I think they know the issue better than I do.
Alex, sorry, I think I'm not sure if your book covers, but the one part, because a lot of times, because right now we are focused on the one with the title lobbyist and the title PR, but we forget the institutions as well. And we forgot the quote unquote quasi lobbyists, like the billionaires who go to countries and drive their own agenda. I mean, I'm very, I mean, I'm so familiar with one, for example. A friend of mine was running a quote unquote good NGO in Kenya, and he was driving and he was fine to do that, but they ran out of money. But then he looked in the bank account, there was $2 million. And when he wanted to spend the $2 million on operations or whatever it is, the quote unquote good donor said, no, you only spend that money on projects I like. So because in many ways, the governments and the wealthy quote unquote philanthropists are in the Western world, in many ways they're also to blame, because they are also they're also trying to prop up their own images across the world. So that's why I like when you say that there's plenty of blame to go around. So it's not just so much quote unquote despots or so people or what are names we call other people who run countries. But it's also, to me, I think you also have despotic businessmen and despotic billionaires and despotic philanthropists, because they also have their own agendas that they're trying to drive in the continent and to the detriment of the continent, because there may have been a better use of that money if you had asked the Africans, how do you want to spend the money if you're going to be there philanthropic?
Yeah, so I guess there are two ways to answer that question. One is directly, does FARA capture those things? No. So FARA's self-reported, it's unevenly policed, and so on and so forth. But it's kind of the best systematic data we have. The second way to answer that question, I think, is to say that all organizations, like pro-democracy activists included, manicure their image. Like, they want to have a positive image of what they're doing. So to me, it's not much a matter of whether you do it or not. It's a matter of the values behind it. So there are billionaires that are kleptocratic and benefit from having a more positive image of authoritarianism in their state. There are also billionaires that do a lot of good work and give to excellent causes that I would support, that support human rights and democracy and transparency and so on and so forth. So to me, it's a question of the values underlying it, and I wouldn't lump them all together in that fashion.
Thanks, Alex. Okay, everyone, I'm going to rattle through some of the questions we've got. We've had such a good discussion that we're starting to run out of time, so I'm going to go through them quickly. As I say, they're in the chat if you people want to check them out, and then I'm going to come to you in the order that you spoke. So we'll be starting with Gina for your responses. Just because we're running out of time, I'll have to ask you all to be fairly quick in your responses. Please feel free to respond to different questions and also to what Alex said as well, but this is what we're going to go with. So Gina, I think Alex has already covered what I was going to ask you, which is, thinking about the extent to which this is an African problem. But I'd also be interested in hearing a little from you about how much this has changed over the last 20, 30 years. You've been at the top of this industry in Kenya for a while. Is this getting more intense? Are we seeing more money spent on this? Did this kind of ratchet up during multi-party politics when governments felt they need to be more accountable domestically? Or has this always been there? If we went back and looked, would we see this there, looking at someone like Mobutu, looking at somebody like Moi? Has this simply been a feature of African politics forever and we just didn't pay enough attention to it? Tebe, I think it'd be really interesting just to hear from you about, is this just something that ruling parties are doing, or are we actually seeing opposition parties doing this as well? I've heard of, fairly big opposition parties in some countries that are employing very similar companies to the ones that we've just talked about working for ruling parties. Doesn't mean those organizations are doing bad things, but I think it'd be really interesting to get a sense of the extent to which this is actually spreading beyond governments to others. Kathleen, be really interested in hearing from you. What do you think in particular the Cameroonian government is hoping to achieve here? Is this about simply improving reputation? Is it about aid money? Is it about sanctions? What's the most important thing that actually is being achieved by this in your case? And do you think it's actually been successful? Because it's one thing to throw a lot of money at the wall. It's another thing to actually persuade Congress in the US to change legislation or to persuade journalists around the world to change the picture. So how successful do you think it's been? And finally, moving on to you, Karim, we've heard a little bit about the US context because there's legislation there that requires a degree of transparency. Does that suggest that one of the things we actually need to campaign for is the same legislation, at least to be in place in the UK, in France, in Germany, where there are also organizations doing this work, but we often know less about them because they don't have to register? Is that something that we could actually start to campaign on domestically? Okay, so rattling through that, and feel free to pick on different pieces. We'll start with Gina and then we'll move through. So Gina, over to you.
So I think you're right. With the onset of multi-party politics, we've seen definitely foreign campaign advisors as a feature of every general election that we've had since multi-party started. And I think, like I said earlier, I think it does go hand in hand with support from private sector that is supporting the government of the day. So I think we're definitely seeing a lot more of that happening. But I do think, going back to a subject that was brought up earlier, that lobbying is definitely much more sophisticated in the Western world, and we've seen how Trump used lobbying himself, and in the end ended up, I think, with the most number of lobbyists in his campaign that's ever been seen. We've seen how Brexit used lobbyists as well. So like I said earlier, I don't think it's just purely an African situation, and I think we definitely need to look at it in its larger context. But for Kenya, definitely since multi-party started, we've seen foreign campaign advisors on every election.
Thank you so much. Tebe, over to you. Thinking about how widespread is this? Is this starting to be something done beyond the government itself?
Well, I think just that very point illustrates the point that this is not just quote unquote by authoritarian leaders or by whatever titles we can put on them. It illustrates the point that the whole concept of PR, the whole concept of lobbying can be used as a very positive instrument of shaping narratives, of shaping perceptions positively, because a lot of times one does not have the know-how of doing it, or one does not have the access. So for example, if I want to tell a good story about the work that's happening in Rwanda or in Ethiopia, I'm just mentioning the two countries we've spoken about, or in Nigeria and all those, they are already being fed stories from CNN to economists to everybody else about different narrative. So for me to be able to counter that narrative and to get the same audience, I then have to speak to people who have access to those audiences. So sometimes that narrative or sometimes that story is not just about the person in power. It could be about the person, like you say, in opposition, who has a different point of view. If they want to get a different point of view, or they want to get on the global stage and be able to get their points of view, so surely they must also have the opportunity to use the same channels. And so, I mean, I'd just like to close that point that you always approach this with an open mind and a balanced view. And secondly, Africans have to be in charge of not only of the narratives, but they must also truly be out there as arbiters and looking and saying, how do we deal with this? How do we sanction, or how do we punish, or how do we deal with this? Rather than sit there and say, look what the world is doing to us. We need to say, world, this is how you need to treat us. So that's what we need to do ourselves, notwithstanding that we have problems, just like the rest of the world has problems. I don't know if this is true, but somebody said of Trump last year when he was in power, somebody said, OBJ Obasanjo said, you see, there Trump illustrates that such behavior is not an African behavior. It is just a general behavior of people who don't want, who some people who want to abuse power. So I think that's an important thing to remember.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for that. Kathleen, coming to you on the issue of, what do you think the key aim here is in your case, and to what extent do you think it's been successful?
I think the key reason why they keep doing this is just very simple. It's longevity. Every single African strongman wants to be in power forever without necessarily saying, hey, this is a monarchy, right? And being in power, they can then reap the different benefits that they want to get. BI is 88 years old. He's been in power for over 38 years. And every single thing that happens, which is negative, devours his reputation. So as a result, it's important for them to use this machinery to whitewash their reputation so that they can then get whatever they want to get. Mind you, most of these strong men are puppets on a string. Whether you like it or not, the history is there. They're puppets on a string to which those who are controlling them have interest within those countries. So as far as their reputations are perceived by the world, as good and fine and dandy. I mean, there was a time in Cameroon where we used to say in French, le pays est bon parce que le pays est un pays de la paix. We used to say all the time that Cameroon is a nation of peace until it imploded, right? Because that was the perception that was driven in the mainstream media in the West and in the regional bloc. And it's so unfortunate that the regional bloc agencies are very quiet on this. But largely, by and large, they have achieved their aim to a certain extent. What is happening is that new media, digital media, is exposing some of these human rights atrocities so fast that they're having a lot of setbacks. And so it's going to be very interesting to see how, they continue to perpetrate these atrocities and cover them when there is technology in the hands of people who are hungry and who are angry. So I think that the government is paying for this. That's the answer to that question. And the goal is just to remain in power for as long as possible. And this is where I agree with Thebe that we are the only ones who can, kick them out of power. And whether you like it or not, a lot of young Africans are dying trying to do this.
Thanks so much. That's a powerful note to end on. And moving over to you, Karine, for that question about, do we need to see legal changes in Western countries? Would that help with this, as well as the kind of activism that Kathleen has talked about?
I do. I think it's important that activists work hand in hand with policy and decision makers. I think it's very important that when we talk about activism, we have to understand what type of activism we're talking about. There's the activism in the street, and there's a different type of activism where it's really about changing the policies and developing new norms and standards, which in my own professional and personal experience, the African Union, the African Commission on Human and People's Rights has done extremely well, for instance. There's a lot we can learn from these different mechanisms and institutions that we have. But at the same time, and I'm going to end on one or two reflections, I think it's important that as we look at what we need to do, we also have to remember two things. One, the progress that we have achieved, and I think Tebe has articulated it. And as we are building a new narrative or reinvigorating a new narrative around the role of these different stakeholders, let's keep in mind to remove, because that's what I sense in some of the discussion, to remove the discussion, to neutralize it from the living impact of colonialism and imperialism as well. Because these are difficult conversations. These are not comfortable conversations that we can have looking at the impact of actions made by companies that are not on the African continent. It can very much resonate with how people view and live the experience of colonialism and imperialism in some cases. And I think we have to be mindful of that. Having said that, I think Kathleen's last point was absolutely fantastic, because young people, young men and women are dying, trying to change the statu quo. And one of the things that is stopping them, one of the stumbling blocks, are actions by some of these PR and lobbyist firms. And I think it's important that we realize that, not as a central key priority, maybe, but definitely something to reckon with and to take a pause on and reflect upon, because this is a new phenomenon. We see it in different contexts. Scrub Associates, I remember a few years back in DC, was working with 3 different governments: Burundi, Uganda, who was mediating the conflict in Burundi, and South Sudan. And as you talk to them and you try to unpack what was going on, you realize that the actions of these different governments and their interests were completely unmeshed and embedded in the operations of the firm itself. And it will not do it would do us a disservice not to actually really look at this issue and work and address it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We're out of time, unfortunately, so I'm going to send it back to Jeff and Kathleen. Just a reminder to check out Alex's book, How to Make the World Safe for Dictatorship. And over to you guys. Thanks so much for everyone for such good answers to those questions. Jeff and Mentade, over to you.
Thank you so much, Nick. I mean, this has been such a great discussion and we could go on, but this is all the time that we have for today. So thank you so much to our viewers for tuning in. And thank you so much to our brilliant panel and to Alex for joining us today. Our entire team looks forward to keeping in touch with all of you and to tracking and highlighting your important work as we move forward. In the meantime, you can keep up to date with the Resistance Bureau by visiting our website, www.theresistancebureau.com, and by subscribing to our newsletter there. We also encourage you to follow our social media platforms on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and on YouTube. Just search for the Resistance Bureau. We really hope that you'll join these important discussions as we continue to bring to you some of Africa's most brilliant and dynamic thought leaders, activists, artists, and relevant professionals. As a final note, putting this show together would not be possible if it wasn't for the team effort that keeps bringing it to life. Thank you so much to our advisory board, as a special shout out to our colleagues, Peter Dory and Dondom Sarah, who are working hard behind the scenes to make this show a success. And for myself, Mandatin Loja, my co-host, Jeffrey Smith, thank you so much for joining us today. Be safe out there, keep fighting the good fight, and we hope to see you in our next program. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having us.